In today's video, we are going to cover the axial skeletal system. Okay, the axial skeletal system, as previously stated, includes the skull, which are the cranial bones and facial bones. Then we have your vertebral column, which is going to be broken down into your cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and then we have the sacrum and coccyx at the end of that, as well as your thoracic cage. So in this video, we're going to specify or specifically look at your vertebral column and the thoracic cage. The next video will be more specific to the skull and facial bones. Okay, so let's look at the regions of your vertebral column. Okay, so we're going to have your standard vertebra. The vertebra are going to be broken down into different regions, your cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions. And they are made up of individual bones in this area. And then here in just a moment, we're going to go through the specific structures that are found on the vertebra. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do, I'm going to jump down. I'm going to skip the cervical spine right now. I'm going to jump down into the thoracic region and look at the specific structures of the thoracic spine. So the thoracic spine, this is going to be below the cervical and above the lumbar region. That's going to consist of 12 vertebra, okay? And they're numbered T1, okay? As you can see, it's labeled on here, T1 down to T12. And how you figure out that's going to be T12 down here, you're going to notice all the ribs are going to be associated with the thoracic vertebra. Okay, so your thoracic cage is going to articulate with the thoracic vertebra. So let's look at your standard vertebra that are going to be consistent with all the vertebra with a few exceptions. Those exceptions I'll point out when we're into the cervical region and the lumbar region to identify those differences. But for right now, these are your standard structures with some slight modifications. What we're looking at here, this is going to be the anterior, this is posterior, this is superior, and then inferior. Okay, what we're looking at on here, the highlighted light blue area, that's the body. Okay, so this whole big structure up front, don't worry about these other colors here. This whole big structure up front, that's called the vertebral body. If it's in the cervical region, it's the cervical body, lumbar body, and in this case, it's thoracic body. Okay, going posteriorly, we're going to see this big old hole. Okay, this is your vertebral foramen. Okay, although it's highlighting the bone. It's not the bone, it's the hole, and your spinal cord goes down that. That's your vertebral foramen, and the spinal cord goes inferiorly, starts at the brain, and works down your spine. Okay, so this is where the spinal cord goes. That's the vertebral foramen. Going laterally on these two things, these are called the transverse process. So if you picture this like a transverse plane, these are the transverse process. Towards the back, this is called the spinous process. Okay, so we have our body, transverse process, spinous process. In between the body and the transverse process, okay, so we're this bone here, that's called the pedicle, P-E-D-I-C-L-E, and between the transverse process and the spine, or the spinous process, this region of the bone is called the lamina. Okay? And superiorly, we've got this thing pointing up, and then we have this thing pointing down. This is the superior articulating facet on the top. And what it articulates, if we put another thoracic vertebra on top of here, that bone will articulate with this bone at those projections. The inferior articulating process, again, if you'd have a bone inferiorly, the superior portions would articulate with this. And if we were to put a bone underneath this, can you see how this makes would make a hole right here. So look at your lab models, and that hole is your intervertebral foramen. Okay? The difference between your vertebral foramen and your intervertebral foramen, okay, is your spinal cord goes down your vertebral foramen, and then individual spinal nerves, the nerves that, say, go down your arm or your legs or go to the organs in your body, exit the spinal column, exit the spinal column through the intervertebral foramen. So look at the models, see what those structures are. Okay, so those are your typical structures associated with all the vertebra, with a couple minor exceptions. Now let's point out a couple little differences. Even though all of them will have spinous processes, the spinous processes in the thoracic spine are angled pretty sharply inferior. So let's look at the, let me look at this one. This should do it, okay? So let's go here. So you can see we have spinous processes here, and they're pretty much straight back, okay? And then when we get into the thoracic spine, you can see how they start to angle pretty sharply inferior. And then when we go to the lumbar, these are stubby things that go straight back, okay? So that's one way to help identify the differences between thoracic, lumbar, and cervical vertebra. So with the thoracic spine covered, let's look at the cervical spine. Cervical spine is going to be the upper portion, and these are the top bones. So this is C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, those are those vertebra. And let me pause this video because I want to bring up and identify the specific structures of the cervical vertebra. Well, let me see if I can do this. So let's look at, here is C4. Let me hide others. Now we can do it this way. But I don't have to pause, okay? So if we're looking at, this is C4, as you can see, the structures are very similar to that of the thoracic spine. Here we have the body. We're going to have the transverse processes coming out this way. We have a lamina. We have a spinous process. And since we're looking at here, there's the first structure. If you recall, in the thoracic spine, it was just one bone coming back. Here, it's bifid. Okay, they're coming out in two different directions. So cervical spine or cervical vertebra have bifid spinous processes. A couple other things that you notice, you can see these two holes here. These are unique to the cervical spine, and those holes are called the transverse foramen. And the transverse foramen carries the vertebral artery, which helps to feed the brain or provide blood to the brain. Okay, so these are transverse foramina. You're going to have a pedicle here, transverse process, lamina, bifid spinous process, vertebral foramen. Okay, and you can see this also will have this little curve here. You're going to have your inferior articular process, superior articular surfaces, and that will make, if you put another bone underneath it, that will make the intervertebral foramen. So let's look at some more of the cervical spine specifically. I think we just pointed these out. Okay, so this is the body. That's going to be the transverse process, transverse foramen. We have your superior articular process, inferior articular process. That's going to be the lamina, and the bifid spinous process, vertebral foramen. So let's look at C1 and C2. These are the two big ones that are different. I'm going to have to do this a little differently here. So let's look at C2 first. Let me hide all the others. And this is what C2 looks like. So look at your lab models, locate this structure, and the biggest identifying feature is going to be this process at the very top. That's called the Odontoid Process, also known as DENS, D-E-N-S. It's like it means tooth. So That's going to be the identifying thing. This part will articulate with the vertebra, C1 vertebra, okay? We still have your vertebral foramen, we have the lamina, we have the spinous process, we're going to have the transverse process, we still have the transverse foramen, this part's the body. So all of those remain the same, but we've also included now the odontoid process or the dens, okay? So let's look at let me show others. Well, let me go back and come back. So let's look at C1 and look at the difference with this one. So locate this bone in your stuff. And you can see we really don't have a body to speak of, okay? So we're going to still have the transverse foramen, transverse processes. We have your superior and inferior articulating process on here. So this will articulate, these areas will articulate with C2. And that dens that we just looked at, that's coming up through the center here. And then that is going to be articulating with this portion, which is called the anterior arch. And that allows for turning your head left and right, or the shaking of your head like no. Okay, so that's C1. And now let's look at the lumbar spine. Okay, the lumbar spine are the last 5 vertebrae. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it goes into the sacrum. So cervical you have 7, thoracic you have 12, lumbar you have 5. And let's look at the basic structures of your lumbar. Again, we still have your body, we have your transverse process, we have your spinous process, we're going to have your lamina. Those are your key things that we want to do this one. And the identifying features of this, you will see extending from your cervical spine down to your lumbar spine. The vertebral bodies and the size of the vertebra get much larger, much beefier in shape because they are weight bearing, okay? So if it has to be more weight bearing or take more weight bearing, then you're going to need the bone structure there to be able to support that weight. So the body is much beefier, and the spinous process, these are these little stubby nose looking things that are thick, that project straight back. They don't really angle down, okay? And we still have our superior and inferior articular processes, or facets, okay? You're still going to have your intervertebral foramen, so check all those out. We have your vertebral foramen, that's still there. Let's look at the sacrum. Sacrum is going to be this bone. You got your posterior surface and anterior. These are your sacral foramina. These are where the nerves exit out. Okay. And then the coccyx is the inferiormost, and these are 3 to 5 fused bones. Okay. And this is also known as your tailbone. That's the sacrum. Be able to identify right and left. First, you have to know anterior, posterior. So it's curving. The anterior is concave, posterior is convex in shape. Posterior is much more rough than the anterior. Let's look at the sternum. Okay, so your sternum is going to be your breastbone. Okay, and the sternum is actually made up of 3 bones. The topmost portion is the manubrium. Then we have the body and the xiphoid process. And if you were to look at the ribs on this one, okay, the ribs, they're associated with, here's T1, and then you go all the way back down to T12. Okay, so all your thoracic vertebra are associated with ribs. And the thoracic cage, or your rib cage, has different bones labeled differently. There's true ribs and false ribs. True ribs are your first 7. So your true ribs are going to be those bones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. False ribs are 8 through 12, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And a subcategory of false ribs are floating ribs. That's 11 and 12, okay? So the difference between true ribs and false ribs is this. If we were to go through here and we were to, this doesn't really highlight that separately, okay? If you were to look at the model, we've got the osseous structure, or the bone, comes around, and then we have, before it inserts into the sternum, we have cartilage. This is called costocartilage. So true ribs have articulation with, or attaches to the sternum with, its own set of costal cartilage. So if you look at rib 1, it goes into the manubrium with its set of costal cartilage. Rib 2 has its separate costal cartilage, all the way down through rib 7. Now if we look at this, although it looks like 7 is also including the 8, 9, and 10, but if you were to look at it histologically and look at the tissue itself, all the costal cartilage for here is associated with rib 7, okay? So all of these are true ribs. 8, 9, and 10 share the costal cartilage with 7. Okay, so 8, 9, and 10 shares its costal cartilage with 7. That makes those false ribs. Now 11 and 12 here, those are floating ribs because it has no costal cartilage attached to the sternum at all. So that's the difference between those. Now you have 12 ribs, 12 pairs of ribs, 12 on each side, okay? And I think that is it for the axial skeletal system. So go through your lab book, look at your models, make sure you can identify each and every one of these, because the quiz, you will be responsible for these on the quiz. Good luck.